You are listening to and streaming a More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai. He's Dr. Calvin John Smiley, Associate Professor of Sociology at Hunter College, the author of a number of books you need to get your hands on. And he is here to help us unpack it all as the frequent contributor he is on the show. Dr. Smiley, welcome back.
Hey, Dr. Nee, how are you?
I'm a little tired.
That's okay. All right.
I'm a little tired, but you know what? Whenever we're in conversation, somehow I get re-energized. So let's go.
Appreciate that.
I want to start with a story that was just brought to my attention. My colleague Jesse Jackson Jr. had posted about this. Nolan Wells' friend Bart has reportedly handed cops a witness list and everything else. TMZ is reporting that Nolan Wells' friend Bart Edmiston Jr. handed investigators a list of potential witnesses and opened up his digital life as authorities probed the 18-year-old's death, according to a new statement from his family. The Edmistons say that Bart sat for interviews. He answered every question and shared his full recollection of July 4th. They say he also let investigators view his phone, provided requested photos and videos, and allowed inspections of his boat and GPS device, all without an attorney, warrants, or hesitation. His family adds that Bart compiled a witness list, including passengers aboard the boat. They believe more than 20 people spread across two vessels saw him help another boat that was taking on water near Horn Island. The family insists that Bart has never been identified as a suspect and flatly denies he killed Nolan, witnessed his death, or helped cover it up. Dr. Smiley, what do you make of this most recent development in the Nolan Wells case?
Well, I think it adds another layer of what is the frustrating part of how we often see two different criminal legal systems. If the roles were reversed, and Nolan Wells was a young white man in a group of young black men out in the on the boats and have you, we certainly would have seen those phones and witness testimonies all collected within hours, all in the probably in the police precinct. So, this is certainly something that hopefully will continue to mount pressure on local authorities to continue to investigate this as not simply an accidental death, but to a homicide, or at least a death that needs to be investigated.
Yeah. I mean, this is it's very strange. It's very strange because I can't make out why folks haven't been deposed. I can't make out why folks have not been, brought in for questioning. This case seems strange, but then again, when you think back to the history of law enforcement in Mississippi, this still tracks. And so we don't want to, race to any conclusions, but it's kind of hard to ignore the history when, we see this, what feels like a parallel track of justice for some, injustice for us.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we saw almost immediately the one young man's mother, who was a judge, coming out and defending the boys, and clearly in a position of power, which could be, can be seen as an obstruction of justice. And, why did it take so long? Why does it continuously take social media pressure and celebrities and others to speak out to even get the most basic sorts of investigations that don't just come from the mouths of the people who are closest to the investigation of "we didn't do it"? That has certainly never worked in American history for Black folks. And we can think about a number of cases, right? Everything from the Scottsboro boys to the Tulsa race riots to, so many others, that the benefit of the doubt was not given to Black folks, even afterwards, right? When investigations had been shown that they had nothing to do with it. And so once again, we see a case and I think, as we can see here, this is a pattern, and even to Mississippi, as I've seen, this is the same coroner who saw that another young black man who was hanging from a tree had done it through suicide. So once again, we see these patterns in a country that has been emboldened over the last 10 years by Donald Trump and other what we call Christian nationalists and far right and neo Nazis. That this sort of behavior is not only acceptable but permissible.
Yeah, yeah. Changing gears, but still, talking about another troubling investigation. We know that court filings in the case Vasquez Perdomo versus Nome included text messages showing federal immigration agents using racial slurs to identify Latino targets during last year's sweeps across Los Angeles. An ACLU attorney on the case said that there's, quotes, enough to suggest this is a system-wide practice of identifying people through racial slurs. Meanwhile, of roughly 1,400 Border Patrol agents involved in the LA operation, more than half reported using personal cell phones for these communications, but only 88 have volunteered those phones for forensic review, and none, count them, none have actually been imaged yet. And so, Dr. Smiley, I got to ask you, your work touches directly on how institutions police and surveil communities of color. What does it tell you when the pattern shows up, not just in tactics on the ground, but in agents' own private language?
Well, I think it highlights that this is not the exception, but often the rule when it comes to law enforcement, particularly when we think about the histories of law enforcement and who law enforcement target, which are often marginalized and other communities that have been pushed to the margins. And so to find out that these sorts of racist slurs and other kind of vulgar language is being used shouldn't be surprising to people in a country that, the kind of origins of policing come out of slave patrols in the South and immigration patrols in the North, right? Whether it was considered the quote unquote dirty Irish or Italians or other immigrants coming to the United States that weren't seen as true blue Americans. And so when we think about the idea of them using their own personal phones, I think it also just highlights the sloppiness of what we're dealing with. But the problem with all of this is there is or rarely is accountability when it comes to law enforcement. There's certainly been different commissions over the last century, whether it was the Knapp Commission and others that did these kind of big sweeping overhauls, but those often do come far and few between. What usually happens is, or at least rather the game plan that we often see, is that this gets relegated down to individual or isolated cases of what they call the quote unquote bad apples or the few bad grapes, as opposed to taking a step back and saying, you know what, no, these are institutional problems. These are cultures that have been, it's a culture of violence that is bred amongst law enforcement. And how do we then get rid of that? But it will, there might be a couple sacrificial lambs, as we might call it, of some of these officers who will be fired, but we won't see it as a indictment on the institutions that have allowed them to use their cell phones, that have allowed chains of command to use racial slurs with impunity. And we also live in a country right now where we have a federal government, as from Donald Trump, and also even at the state and local level, where if you say something or criticize policing, you are somehow un-American. And it's very few politicians that want that on their resume as being seen as anti-American or anti-cop, because that can certainly cost them future elections and fundraising, et cetera.
Yeah, you're right, and willing to pay a heavy price to whatever it takes to not be seen as soft on crime in any way, shape, or form. Dr. Smiley, we keep hearing a few bad apples. You just brought it up. We keep hearing that as defense whenever conduct like this surfaces. At what point does the data itself, the scale, the consistency, at what point does the data itself start to undermine that defense?
Well, it's already have, right? I mean, we could just look at the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a 50+ year failure of, throwing massive amounts of money, billions of dollars, at the so-called drug problem, putting millions of people in prison, and it hasn't worked. In fact, we know that when we look at drug data, people are using drugs even more now than when the war on drugs had started. So if we're thinking about a system in which care and help is needed, then policing is not the answer. We, as many have shown, we will never police our way out of crime. What the data does show is that when you provide stability in people's lives, such as affordable, safe housing, educational equity, universal health care, employment opportunities, places for leisure and recreation, crime goes down. Overwhelmingly, crime goes down. And so we have to kind of really get people who are elected officials in those positions that aren't going to be afraid when the police and the right-wing pundits and the reactionaries start saying, well, you're soft on crime or you're anti-American. You have to kind of, unfortunately, weather that storm, because what we've seen, especially in the kind of post-Black, I don't want to say post-Black Lives Matter, but, since Black Lives Matter has become, a national and international movement, is that kind of individual is seen as the problem. So, if we think back to Derek Chauvin was given 20 years, and, right wingers and others said, well, see, justice was carried out. But yet the city of Minneapolis had several cases where they had killed or harmed residents in the years preceding that. So this is not about one bad apple or one bad cop, but rather an institution that has allowed these types of behaviors to proceed and only call them out when there's a mounting pressure.
Well, speaking of an institution being called out, I want to talk a little bit about AIPAC, because they're having a little branding trouble, as some folks are reporting. Our friends over at The Guardian published an article that caught my attention. I'm interested in what your take is. They talk about Daniel Bliss. And for folks who are unfamiliar, Daniel Bliss, he clinched the Democratic nomination in Illinois' 9th congressional district just this past March. And he did something that politicians don't always do in their victory speeches. He paid homage to a certain lobby group. He said this victory belongs to J Street. That's what he said. So everybody voted in the election. He said, but this victory belongs to J Street. And the reference was to the pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy advocacy organization, the longtime underdog rival to Capitol Hill's powerhouse AIPAC. And while both groups support a majority Jewish homeland in the state of Israel and in favor of American security assistance, J Street also backs the creation of a Palestinian state and opposes Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And so Daniel Bliss, facing intense competition from progressive anti-Zionist journalist Kat Agbuzala, an avowedly pro-Israel state senator, he embraced J Street's centrism, and he was pretty triumphant. So, when we come forward, Dr. Smiley, I want to ask you, just real broadly, we're seeing a moment where younger, more progressive voices, including folks in Jewish American communities, are pushing back on how pro-Israel politics get defined in Washington. When we come forward, I want to get your take on what's driving that generational and political shift, and what we might expect as we inch towards November. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. More with Dr. Calvin John Smiley when we come forward. You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai. He's Dr. Calvin John Smiley, Associate Professor of Sociology at Hunter College. And right before the break, we were talking about AIPAC sort of brand trouble. It's opening the door for a rival, J Street, for folks who may be more or less familiar. And Dr. Smiley, I was asking you, to talk a little bit about what's driving this generational and political shift where people are pushing back. Jewish folks are pushing back on how pro-Israel politics gets defined, at least in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And I think one thing that we always have to make that distinction is the difference between Judaism as a religion and culture versus Zionism as a political ideology. And AIPAC is certainly driven by a Zionist ideology. So one does not have to be Jewish to support AIPAC. And we know that AIPAC is, while not registered as a government entity, certainly operates as one. And as we've all seen over the last almost 3 years, we've seen the carnage that is the Israeli state, which is certainly a rogue state, which is certainly a genocidal state that is murdering not only men and women but children by the thousands, and completely devastating the infrastructure and environment. To your question about this J Street, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is that when you look them up, there's still a pro-Israel lobby. So, there becomes this kind of like liberal Zionism that if we just get rid of Netanyahu, all of the sins of Israel go away. And it's a very parallel argument that people make about Donald Trump, right? If we just get rid of Donald Trump, all of the sins of America go away, or it's this, or it harkens to the when people start saying this is not who we are, this is not America. No, that is who Israel is, right? When we look at 4867 in 2023 and in many years in between, the colonial settler project of what is Israel has expanded even without Netanyahu in power. And so, is there lobbying agencies like J. Crew that are trying to distance themselves from AIPAC, which is seen as the more right-wing and ultra-conservative sort of PAC? Certainly, but I wouldn't be saying that J Street is the one that is bringing in that actual peace. I mean, when you look them up, they're calling for a two-state solution, but what does that really mean at this point when you've devastated all of the places in where Palestinian people live, are continuing to be pushed off their land? A group that we would really want to see is a group that says one free Palestine. I think would be an organization that I could get behind. So seeing people move to J Street over AIPAC, it's as Malcolm X would say, if you stab a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 3, is that progress? And I'm not really sure if J Street is that progress that we should be looking for.
Dr. Smiley, from a sociological lens, is this a genuine value shift, or is this just a response to how visible the human cost of the Gaza war has become through social media and in ways earlier generations just didn't have access to? I mean, it seems to me that you can see this two different ways, two very distinct ways.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand how anyone could continue to say, this is still a defensive fight for Israel, right? I mean, a lot of people used October 7th as this kind of springboard of what Israel does in response as justification. Well, even if you have that as your kind of argument, at what point does that get exhausted where, we are now seeing through the live streaming from IOF soldiers and others on the ground through social media of like, this is not the case, right? This is certainly an onslaught of people, an ethnic cleansing, a displacement. And once again, it did not start on October 7th. And I think more and more people who even thought, okay, October 7th was bad and, Israel has a right to defend itself. We are now in a moment where people are getting more of that history, or at least looking into that history. And one thing I always like to point out, I pointed out, I believe on this show before, is that the Human Rights Watch said said that 2022 was the deadliest year for children in the West Bank at the hands of Israeli settlers and soldiers. That was before October 7th, 2023. And so the people of the land of Palestinian background, Palestinians themselves, people in Gaza, they've been living under this constant threat of expulsion, constant threat of violence, and constant threat of demise for the last 75 plus years. And so we are now seeing that in 4K. If we say African Holocaust was something that was recorded through both oral tradition in writings, and the Jewish Holocaust was filmed and then seen afterwards, what is happening to Palestinians is happening in real time. And how can you look away?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to switch gears and talk about the Democrats' roadmap. So many questions that the Democrats have to iron out, having a little bit of an identity crisis, to put it mildly. But a new report from law professor Joan C. Williams and the Center for Working Class Politics director Jared Abbott, they argue that the Democratic Party's internal fight between progressives and moderates, it misses the point entirely. The answer isn't centrism, it's respect for where working class voters are actually coming from. Their core argument: people need a sense of personal and economic security before they'll support the changes that progressives are calling for. And notably, when researchers poll tested issues that weren't top priorities for working class voters, but reframed them around working class values, that shift, it actually moved opinion, meaning it's not necessarily the policy that's the problem, it's the pitch. And so I'm going to ask you this, Dr. Smiley, from a sociological lens: is this a messaging problem, or does it reflect something deeper about how the party has related to working people, especially working people of color, for the last decade?
I think it's both, actually. I think there's certainly a messaging problem where there has been a kind of, whether true or not doesn't really matter, but how the Democrats have been framed as kind of the party of the elite, even though that may or may not be the case. Looking at people like Hillary Clinton, she herself is a war hawk, and others were certainly not the ones that working class people wanted to get behind. We saw that shift with Obama, right? There was a bit of hope. There was a bit of resilience there, something new. We've also seen it with the messaging of Bernie Sanders and Mayor Mamdani, which is about affordability and universal safety nets. The DNC seems to be working overtime to try to fight against that. At least it seems from a messaging standpoint to be fighting harder against that than they are against Donald Trump. Again, whether true or not does not matter. It's about the messaging. The other part is, what are the policies in which that they are championing? They seem, and again, we can use, Kamala Harris's run as one of the most recent litmus tests. The messaging and the policy of, we're going to do everything that Donald Trump did, but we're not Donald Trump, isn't always great. Saying you're going to be the toughest person on the borders isn't necessarily going to win you progressives. It isn't going to win you people who don't want to see that. Having unwavering support for Israel in the aftermath of what we just discussed also is not going to win you things. Saying that we're going to sign oaths that capitalism is the best thing ever when capitalism has never afforded Black and other marginalized people is certainly not just about the messaging, but about the policy in which they are looking towards. And I think if we want to see a true Democratic Party, then they have to stop fighting the more progressive wing and kind of say, this is where we're winning, or this is where we're seeing traction. This whole idea of like, we need to walk across the aisle hasn't worked in the last decade plus. And we have a Republican Party that clearly doesn't want to work across the aisle. So why keep running into the brick wall is what I would say.
Well, and where it has worked in terms of passing bipartisan legislation, folks on the left have had to water it down quite a bit in order to get over the finish line. And so that's worth noting. I mean, when I read this article, I think what came off to me was this idea that Black and brown people aren't working class folks. I felt like the author of this article wasn't talking to us. And so let me speak to us. Black and Latino working class voters, and I know we aren't a monolith. But we have historically been the backbone of Democratic coalitions. And so what's different? What's different about how this current moment of economic anxieties hitting communities of color versus the framing in national media, which I think often centers white working class voters.
Right, and I think it goes back to when we think about the whole narrative around who Joe Sixpack is, right? Joe Sixpack was
Mhm.
always considered kind of the working class white man, but I mean, there's also a longer history around what the working class was. I mean, I'm a pro-union guy, but unions, especially some unions, have a dark history of being isolating and pushing out people of color, and so where we come into this is, I think, from a perspective of that we need to have candidates who are open to sitting down with Black and brown working class communities and not seeing us, like you said, as a monolith, or even seeing us as a one-dimensional sort of figure, right? I'm done with the days of politicians trying to relate to Black people. We don't need you to relate to us. We need you to understand us. So I don't care if Hillary got hot sauce in her
And
bag,
deliver.
and
And
deliver
deliver.
and deliver. I don't need to know that Joe Biden had his imaginary Black friend named Corn Pop. I don't need to know that that they can do a Black scent if they need to, or they listen to Kendrick Lamar. Like, none of that matters to me. What matters is, how are you going to put legislation together that is going to support Black communities, Black families, and other marginalized communities as well. And so I think that really becomes the crux of it all.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And last Friday I had a chance to attend my very first working families party event in LA. They hosted a convention here. Our leaders, learners, and listeners might remember that Maurice Mitchell, the national director of Working Families Party, joined us here on A More Perfect Union. That podcast is available wherever where we get your podcast. But it was the first time that I felt like there was an organized effort to match that MAGA energy. I felt like they were focused, they were determined, they were thinking about beyond this election cycle. I mean, they're thinking well into the 2030s, right? They really understand that what they're up against is not a personality, not the personality of Donald Trump or the cult of personality of Donald Trump. It's authoritarianism, full stop, on all levels of government, and so um, you know with that, I want to just transition to this next story because there's another poll that caught my attention. A poll on arresting Benjamin Netanyahu. A new Economist YouGov poll found that 49% of Americans believe that the U.S. should arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu under the International Criminal Court's warrant versus 27% who opposed it. It's a striking 22-point margin. Broken down by race, 53% of Black respondents and 52% of Hispanic respondents supported the arrest. 58% of voters age 18 to 29 agreed. The numbers line up directly with the call made by your mayor, New York City Mayor Zoran Mandami, who said that he lacked the legal authority himself, but called on the federal government to execute the warrant. Nearly half the country, Dr. Smiley, across a genuinely diverse coalition, landing in the same place as Mamdani. What does that tell you about where the base of the Democratic Party actually is right now versus where its leadership is?
Well, I think what we can say is that clearly the country is speaking out and knowing that we are not in support of what Netanyahu's doing, and we're going to see a federal government that won't arrest him, but will turn around and kidnap presidents in Venezuela. So clearly, the United States has the ability to do these things, but won't when it's not in our self interest.
When we come forward, the robot teacher New York almost put in a classroom and why it got yanked before day one. You're listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580, The Quiet Part Out Loud with Dr. Calvin John Smiley. You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. This is our final story. It's The Quiet Part Out Loud and New York edition. The Salamanca City Central School District, did I get that right, Dr. Smiley? Salamanca?
I have no idea. That's not one of the five boroughs. So That's a
Well,
whole different world.
we're gonna go with Salamanca for 1,000 and hope it's a daily double. That City Central School District in upstate New York, located on the Seneca Nation of Indians Reservation, approved a nearly $60,000 purchase of a humanoid AI robot from Realbotix. Yeah, nicknamed Sally. Instead, to help students in robotics and technology class, the plan hit a wall when parents and teachers learned Realbotix has a sister company that produces hyper realistic sex bots. The teachers union president didn't hold back, saying that a robot built by companies associated with sex dolls has no business in our classrooms. And the district says the pilot is on hold while it works through enhanced student data privacy agreements with the state education commissioner, Betty Rosa. Now, Dr. Smiley, we have talked about surveillance and data, but this one adds a layer: corporate lineage. When the tech in your kid's classroom shares a parent company with adult sex robots, what's the actual due diligence process that school boards should be running before signing a check?
Well, I think the broader issue is that we're seeing we're in an age of AI and robotics in which it is packaged as convenience and smart and unbiased, but then more nefarious is that it's collecting data, it's pushing out people from jobs, and we don't know where this data is going. So, you know, sex robots or not, I'm not really sure why anyone would say, "Hey, let's replace people with a humanoid that, you know, is not doing anything other than regurgitating human thought through an AI powered database." And this machine is going to be looking at our kids and probably taking some kind of facial recognition to learn our children's names and biometric data. And all that data is going to be stored somewhere. And we really do not know what that data is going to be used for. It is strange that a sex bot company would be also in schools, but I'm just of the thinking that we need to move away from the kind of Black Mirror dystopian futures in which everyone seems to be speeding towards.
Absolutely. Well, look, in about 60 seconds, Dr. Smile, I've got to ask you if districts are going to keep experimenting with AI in the classroom, what would a genuinely community-driven approval process look like versus a top-down rollout? What's just one thing in 60 seconds that you would offer up?
I think you have to get what the community wants out of their AI. Like, what are they hoping that these kind of tools were going to be used in terms of providing workforce development, educational training for their students? And if they can't provide clear and defined answers, then this should be something that we should avoid at all costs.
And that is the final word on this. Today, we watched a confirmation vote hang on a rich man's tax bill, a stomach bug take over 45 states, drones patrol school hallways because Congress won't touch gun laws. And through it all, communities from Watts to East Brunswick to Salamanca, New York, reminding us that the fight for dignity doesn't take a day off. Bishop Joseph Tolton, Richard A. Fowler, Dr. Calvin John Smiley, thank you for bringing your wisdom. And to everybody riding with us in afternoon drive time, we appreciate you too. The Village helps us produce a more perfect union each and every day. Our executive producer, Tavis Smiley, our sound engineer, Brother Andy, our show producers, Art and Faraji. We thank each and every one of you. Remember, don't panic, organize. Do what you can from where you are with what you have, but by all means, do something. Our nation depends on it. You've been listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580.